Qiana, I will hand it off to you.
Great. And I'm off mute. Great. Awesome. Thank you. Evening, everybody. I'm really excited to be moderating this panel and getting a chance to talk to folks, and also really interested in the breakouts and hearing where folks are landing. But before we do that, I wanted to also set some community agreements that I hope that we're all able to share and hold. And I will be facilitating in the breakout and also moderating with support of Anya. And Alexis will be a co-facilitator as well. So we'll be holding each other accountable, and we hope that there's self-accountability as well as each other accountable. And what we're hoping is a safe and constructive space where there might be conversations and topics that will bring up different issues and things for folks and dynamics. So let's try to be there for each other. But in order to kind of ground, I like to offer community agreements and conversations. Any folks have thoughts or additional ones that you like, feel free to add in the chat. But I thought for us, we can start with listening actively. So if you're able and present and want to be off video, to be on the video and see us, that's really great. It helps the conversation and the flow and talking to live folks, but also holding that is nighttime and is Zoom and the COVID life. So if we're just asking folks to listen as actively as you can, share as intentionally as you can, whether your video is on or off. One mic, one speaker, meaning, there's a lot of chatter that can happen and then we don't really get to hear each other. So not only trying to make sure that we give folks each a chance to speak, so like sharing the mic and making sure we're really maximizing the time and sharing it collaboratively, but also when one is speaking, not to have background noise or to speak over, because then we won't hear each other. The other thing I would mention is we're not able to offer translation tonight, but in case there are different ears in language, just helping something for me too, is to encourage to speak a little bit slowly so folks are able to kind of hear. And if you need that, maybe doing a sign, and I think there's some reaction buttons, just to let us know if we're talking too fast or going on too quickly, or want something to be repeated, happy to say it again or add it in the chat. Step up, step back. This is really going to come in handy when we're in the breakout room, so we'll remind folks again. That is like the dynamic of not just stepping up to share, but also making sure that if you're one that talks freely, to make sure that you're sharing intentionally, but also making sure other folks are sharing. If there's something you want to affirm, feel free to use the reactions. Snaps and fingers are really good just to make sure we're moving the conversation. But also if you're someone who maybe doesn't naturally like to speak up, we want to make sure we're also creating space for folks to share as well. And when we're talking about sharing tonight, especially in the breakout rooms in particular, we're talking about verbal and written as well. I want folks to feel that this is a live chat in the live chat, so please write. And also, if you feel more comfortable there, we'll be capturing notes and comments there as well as verbal. So sometimes you might make a point, but there's something else you want to add. I know that happens to me all the time. Feel free to add it in the chat. We don't, we just want to make sure we're passing the mic well. And yeah, active chat. And I also want to hold that, we want to keep to our time as much as possible, and we want to maximize the panel time as well as the breakout time, your time. So if there are topics that need a little bit more, say, fertile ground, or it's a topic that we're not able to really fully unpack tonight, or there's more information, feel free to add resources in the chat, but also see the chat as a community garden or bike lot. And we might encourage in facilitation as well, if there's certain points that we're just getting stuck on, or there's just things that are going to be a little bit more complicated for this conversation, to add it in the chat, so it's something that we can take back and we're looking at notes, but also things that people can also chew on together, marinate a little bit longer there. So again, let's make sure everyone gets a chance to share. And with that, I'm going to transition into our panel. And we're going to do this a little differently. Instead of doing intros and reading bios, what I'm going to encourage our panelists to do is introduce themselves, first and last names, and tell us briefly about you and your journey into this work and how does your work intersect with food. But don't forget to tell us where you work currently or previously on Brooklyn land. So let's kick off with Saada.
Okay. Hi. Oh, I apologize if there's like the heat just turned on, so there might be a little bit of background noise. But I'm Saada Amadu. I currently work for an emergency food provider as a policy associate, and currently we're not based in Brooklyn, but we used to be out of the Brooklyn Navy Yard, with most of our services, actually majority of our services, still go through food recipients in New York, in Brooklyn, sorry. That's it. So what is my background with food? So I experienced food insecurity at a very young age, but it's a bit of a different circumstance in that I experienced food insecurity in Ghana, where there isn't such a thing as actually like a structured emergency food provider. So it's and it actually happens in a lot of the developing world, where maybe like, so here in the US, maybe unfortunately, if you're hungry, maybe you can go to food pantry or a soup kitchen. Usually, especially in a lot of African countries, that usually doesn't exist. It's now becoming a thing, but by the time that I was experiencing food insecurity, that wasn't a thing. But that also said, in context of like a US or New York context, when we first moved to the US, actually we were initially on food stamps. So I also went through food insecurity in New York, so I kind of understand a little bit of that landscape. And right now my work is not majority of advocating to expand food stamp, but it is one of the things that I'm trying to push for, and also just trying to get government grants and also hopefully change the landscape around like a little bit of like a combination of emergency food assistance, because there are actually people who are hungry right now, and long-term resilience, thinking of actually putting systems in place where in the long term, where people are not completely dependent on the emergency food sector. Anyways, that's my background.
Oh, awesome. Thank you. What a great way to start. I'm going to pass the mic to Sawdayah.
Good evening. My name is Sawdayah Brownlee, and I am based in Weeksville, which is also known as Crown Heights in Brooklyn. I am currently the board president of the Brooklyn Queens Land Trust, which is one of a myriad of intersections that I have with land and with food. I love to cook. I've been a farmer. I'm currently someone who maintains relationships with community gardeners, supporting community gardeners within the land trust. And I hope that I answered all the questions. I think I did.
I think you did. The one thing that I would say is that Sawdayah is fresh off her amazing keynote from Grow Together's, the Green Thumbs Grow Together conference, that I hope there's recordings out there and folks can catch as well.
There is a recording.
That's the one thing I would add. Thank you. Let's pass the mic to Kenny.
Hi, everybody. My name is Kenny. Thank you all for being here. Thanks to Ben and Qiana for having me. My background in food is kind of three-pronged. So I studied community and environmental sociology at University of Wisconsin. Outside of school, I was a very active musician, managed an art gallery, music venue, and an arts and music festival. And after college, I started cooking professionally and moved to New York to continue pursuing cooking. And that's when I found North Brooklyn Farms. For those who don't know it, North Brooklyn Farms was a urban farm, public park, event space, bike track, kind of like community center in Williamsburg. And when I found it, I fell in love because it combined all these things that I was very passionate about: food, farming, art, community, culture, kind of DIY spirit. And long story short was that I never really left the farm since that first day I found it. volunteered every day I could, helped develop the events program there, and eventually served as a co-executive chef and planned the public programming. And unfortunately, the farm was a temporary project on privately owned land that was awaiting development, which I think we're going to touch on later. And after 7 years in operation, our lease wasn't renewed, and that was early 2020. But all those years on the farm, we all realized how incredibly potent like food, agriculture, public space are to building community resilience, and how the gathering space in a garden, productive garden environment really brings people together and opens up conversation, nourishes people, connects people to like our shared humanity on the land. And it's in that spirit, and having learned so much from COVID, we're working to launch a new program, or a new project called Brooklyn Public Farm, and just hoping to build on what we started at North Brooklyn Farms, grow food, bring people together, and demonstrate what's possible on vacant land.
Great, thank you. And last but not least, and we're gonna do this intro a little differently. We're gonna incorporate a brief clip of Ximena's art and installation, and then we'll have her explain, introduce herself.
We'll do the video first.
Yes. I mean, introduce herself, not explain, sorry.
What is your first memory of food? Do you know where your food comes from? Where, how, and with whom do you eat?
Thank you for playing that, Ben, and thank you, Qiana, and all the other panelists for being here today, and all of you for sharing some time. It was weird to see it it was lagging, and the voices were like from another world, so it was weird to see the video this way. So my name is Ximena Garnica, and I am an immigrant from Colombia. I'm also a multidisciplinary artist and choreographer and director. And for the past 20 years, I have been based in what we know as Brooklyn. And I live in a converted garage space that serves as a home and also as a studio and also as a community building space around different artistic practices, especially those centering in the body in relationship with other materialities and entities, including natural elements, objects, and also food. And I work collaborative with my partner. He's also an immigrant from Japan, and we lead a company called the Le May Ensemble with international and national dancers. And our works, like I say, when I say a lot our and we, because we work together, and a lot of the works are built in collaboration. And we hope that we can instigate some sort of circulation of relationalities. And the work is aimed to kind of open some cracks in the spectators and also in us as a creators to reflect on questions of being, of questions on perception, interdependency, coexistence, and through poetry, we hope to then get into dialogue and then open possibilities for social and also for personal action or transformation. And I'm invited here today, but because I think the past 3 years we've been working in an artistic project called Emil, and we continue to bring different encounters to this project. The video you saw is like excerpts from different parts of this project. And we started the project with the aim to elevate the act of eating together and while reflecting on our post-industrial relationship with food. And it has taken us on a personal journey from changing our food consumption habits, learning how to grow some food, cooking with each other, with the strangers. And we keep questioning and looking for spaces and people from which we could continue to learn about food and all the tensions that post-industrialism and land displacement and racism have brought to us. So I feel very lucky to be here with you all tonight. Thank you for having me in this space.
And I just want to jump in quickly and just say, even though I work in public service now and serve our community in a government function, I have an arts background for most of my life. And I just feel that is an element missing a lot in public policy discussions, that artists like Ximena and others add a perspective to questions that we face on an everyday basis that you may not normally have. And I think that pieces like that and others can help policymakers really understand and see things differently. So I'm glad, everybody on the panel, I'm glad to have here, and I'm glad to have the arts represented.
Thank you. Thanks for sharing that. It was a great kickoff. And Leah, let's start there. I mean, I think, when we think about like food in our community and in culture as well, there's a breadth of like food models that have been going on or active or have started pre-COVID or active since COVID as a response to the crisis. And taking a different approach to talking about food models with a lens of self-determination or a lens of community leadership. I wanted to open it up to our panelists. If you can share more about the work that you do and the food models that you engage in and how it engages community stakeholders. Are they recipients? Are they stewards? Are they leaders of these food models and work in tackling food access? How about we start with Saada, and then we'll kick it to Sawdayah.
Okay. Thank you, Qiana. So I work in the emergency food sphere. I know like the main point of this to think more like long-term, but I work in the emergency sphere where community engagement, unfortunately, for the most part, is more of like a recipient end of it. So we provide the meals and people accept it. But one of the things that we're currently trying to integrate, and also as I think of like the work that I do in food sphere in general, is trying to have not to use buzzword, more like a bottom-up approach where the community is actually defining what it is that they need. So again, while we need to be thinking long-term, unfortunately, there are actually people who are actually hungry right now. I've been on the receiving end of receiving several phone calls of people saying, okay, I live alone, none of my family members are here, I'm a senior citizen and I can't go outside to get food, and because of COVID, I can't go out. What can I do? So there is that sphere, but one of the things that we're trying to change is trying to have, like I said, have the community define it. So how we're doing that is now like, okay, for instance, if you go to a community where it's a Malaysian neighborhood that also need halal food, while you can give them food that maybe it's like maybe some sort of like a Dominican meal, people will still eat it, but at the end of the day, that still makes them food insecure to a certain extent, because that's not the culturally appropriate meals that they're tailored to. So the way that we're looking at it is trying to have the community define what it is that they need, even if it's still an emergency food aspect. But there is also a way of like engaging other like community stakeholders, because we also partner with restaurants as well. So usually the idea is, okay, you find a community-based organization in the neighborhood, whatever the neighborhood needs, then you find a restaurant, ideally in close proximity to that same neighborhood, that can provide those meals in that sphere. So I think like for particularly this panel, I want you to think about, while like the panel is about long-term strategies, there are actually people who are hungry right now, and we're trying to incorporate like the community into our decision-making as much as possible.
Great, thank you. Yeah, do you want to add, Sawdayah?
Sure. I also really appreciate your emphasis on that, Saada. I did work with a mutual aid project I guess we started in April and then continued through June, distributing milk crates to folks who wanted to grow whatever they needed, you know. When we had seeds, we distributed those as well. And, you know, to the point of growing food, it takes time, right? So the things that we need when we're growing food, we're growing medicine, they're not available immediately or overnight. And so I do think that there is space and there is room for both models to coexist while we transition to providing more self-determination, more opportunities for self-determination and sustainability for community members. And I don't want to say providing, I really want to say, you know, what are the ways that those of us who are in positions of opportunity or decision-making can pass that back to folks within the community, because really, I think we all, in some way, shape, or form, know what's best for us. So to that end, the Community Land Trust that I support in stewarding was founded 16 years ago by community gardeners. And land trusts are, while they are private land, they are available for public access. They are free public spaces for the community to determine the ways that they'll be used. Community gardens, as I'm sure so many of you know, are important for growing food, important for growing medicine, but also free, open, green spaces where folks can congregate. So many things happen in community gardens: education, organizing, movement work. Many community gardens come out of a history of political organizing as well, in addition to just community organizing and community maintenance, right? I think it's always really important when we're talking about politics and food and these really large terms to remember that the people who get that done and the people who are impacted by that are communities of people in relationships. So parents, children, teachers, you know, all manner of folk who come together with an intense regard for one another and for their neighborhoods. And that's how the Brooklyn Queens Land Trust was born, this really intense regard for being able to hold on to spaces that so many people labored without, you know, without money, without support from city, state, federal government, endeavor to make these spaces hubs for people to continue to build with one another, as well as to grow food, grow medicine. And that went on for, you know, 30, 40 years until, like Qiana referenced in the beginning, the Giuliani period, when plots and open lots were up for sale for about $1. And so the land trust, in terms of self-determination, for example, our board of directors has to be made up of majority garden members. And so that's folks who are members of community gardens within our network. The majority of our 15-person board has to be garden members. And we are elected by our garden membership. That is, I want to just lift that up as something that's unique to board of directors. Board of directors are not often in place or put in place by the stakeholders, the people they're supposed to be in service of. And that's exactly how we become elected to the position. In addition to the nominations committee vetting us, the nominations committee also being made up of majority garden members. So I'm very proud to be a part of a space where the land is collectively owned in a way and managed for public interest.
Thank you. I want to invite Ximena and Kenny to join as well. If there's ways that you might want to share around how your work engages community stakeholders. Or has. Mm-hmm.
Sure. Yeah. I would like to just, agree with everything Sawdayah was saying, and I guess it's just incredibly important for green space projects moving forward to be built by and for the the communities that they are within. And in regards to like how I viewed our work at North Brooklyn Farms and kind of moving forward into this next project is we were trying to provide a platform or a space for the community to gather kind of amongst food, to gather around food and just build those connections that keep communities strong in times of crisis. And I think having gone through this COVID crisis, it has just highlighted to me how important not only green spaces and gardens are, but just general community gathering spaces to give people the opportunity to like build those connections with their neighbors to help the communities help themselves, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I would agree.
Yeah, I echo. Yeah, I echo Kenny's. For me, our work is about bringing people to share time and space together. That when we create works, especially the live arts, is about bringing a space together for celebration. Some artists think of their work like that, some others don't. I personally think of our works as an opportunity for ritual and create space for togetherness and to question things and to ask for things and to confront things. We have something we call generative confrontation, especially as immigrants and as people coming from like really, especially Chigi and me, Japanese, Colombian, it's like always this confrontation. And we have the stakeholders of like, yes, our community that create with us in the space, the public when we go out and confront it, whether it's in the street, in a community garden or in a theater or in a gallery space. But there is also the personal relationship with us with food is really like very important in our home, like cooking. It's very important. Chigi cooks every meal and the company eats together. So there's time where like, okay, everybody, time to eat. And we all come to the table and eat together. And this is something we bring from home. And we miss it here because there is some sort of isolation, especially in this capitalism system and workaholics that we all become. You know, the moment that space for eating gets completely taken away from the rhythm of life, and the rhythm of life is different of the rhythm of the economy and the rhythm of society. There is a rhythm of the earth. So a lot of our work has been how we, knowing that we belong to those people have been uprooted, that already we are in a fragile, the fragility with the connection with earth is already present in us. How as uprooted people, we find these connections in roots and in the spaces of difference and in a gentrified neighborhood as ours. You know, we've been here 24 years in a garage space that we fought to have, but it's hard to like find also that space to make community. How you keep that space is key. And then just quick, another thing that COVID did, of course, food insecurity, like Saada said, it's been, it's affect for it. Many communities have been in food insecurity forever. Mm-hmm. And what happened to COVID is that communities that maybe were not prone to food insecurity suddenly became also confronting food insecurity, some of them for first time ever in the city. I say, like, my dancers and the community of artists I belong to, many have second jobs in the food industry, and they lost their jobs, and they didn't have like safe checks because artists are not considered workers. So we don't really have a living wage, and that means that people live check to check, and once there was no job, there was no food. So we created a fund called the Cultural Solidarity Fund that is actually launching this Friday. And we're providing like small mini grants for cultural workers and artists, including custodians in theaters and dance studios. And the idea is to how we contribute a little bit. And it's not about, it's hard because then you are in this, it's not about charity, like Saada say, we have to move from that place. But right now we are in an emergency situation too, and we all see it in all of our communities.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think it's really important, and I'm really glad that folks are lifting up not just the models that we work in, but what these models bring and how we activate on different land, and the importance of relationships and how food brings us together, whether it's breaking bread or growing with each other, or just being a space for like respite and like community gathering. And it connects us all, but at the same time, holding that so many of us are facing these different inequities around our food security, but also how tenuous it is, and how easily we might need to respond in an immediate way. But is that going to continue to address the issues, or is it actually dismantling the issues that we're facing? Or are we creating more opportunities for more folks to then become persistently food insecure? And then the intersection of food insecurity with job insecurity, economic security. You know, oftentimes we talk about food or food systems in these very siloed ways, whether it's pastoral around land, and then at the same time say like we're struggling, you know, with jobs and housing, but these are really like intersecting issues. And I think when we, you know, see it in the lens of like food apartheid, then we start to see how purposeful that segregation of resources are, and how neighborhoods start to then become the neighborhoods that we grow into. What becomes gentrified, what doesn't, what was there before, and what wasn't. So like when Ben mentioned, you know, the land, and I think if we looked at even the CLT map and overlap that, we start to see neighborhoods that were divested from, as you know, Sawdayah was saying earlier, and like people to reclaim that land to grow, to build, and yet now we're looking at gentrified spaces. And I also want to hold, like, even in the transition of talking about land, and we're talking about land tenure, and we'll talk about stewardship and stuff, that we're still talking about land on stolen land, right? Like we're still talking about ways that we're hoping to push ownership, or ways to steward with each other collaboratively, and that our current systems are not only built in inequity, but we're still working with current policies that don't even speak or address that, let alone what we can do now. And I very much see like our boroughs and our neighborhoods as ancestral lands to many of us. And so when we talk about being kept away from our homelands, you know, I think we can also see that here too. So we're starting to see and starting to think about land is not just a connection to food, but like arts and culture. And I think that that's a really good segue in terms of like that connection between art and culture and the power of land and stewardship of that. You know, I think of I think of like, to me, when I first think of art, and I was looking at this Black art documentary last night, it reminded me, like in District 33, in I would imagine Community Board 1, the installation of Kara Walker of the Marvelous Sugar Baby, or the Subtlety at Domino Sugar Factory, right? So this is like the district that we're talking about that Ben is running for. But even that is a good example of like art and bringing in other folks to that community. But then what happened with that land? That land then got bought, privatized. And I think, you know, Kenny, this might be a good intro to jumping into what, you know, the tenure of that land, and something that you touched on earlier about what you were able to do and what you were able to do on that land and why your tenure is so tenuous. And then we'll open it up to other folks.
Sure. Yeah, that's a good segue because North Brooklyn Farms was a part of that same development as the Kara Walker exhibit. So we were just on the other side of the historic Domino Sugar Factory building. I guess just briefly, the story of how that project happened was the developer Two Trees, who owns that entire parcel from North 3rd to with the 5 blocks on the waterfront there up to the Williamsburg Bridge. They put out a request for proposals for interim use for 2 years for the original Domino Sugar Factory parking lot. And the North Brooklyn Farms was one of the recipients. There were multiple recipients to share a lot that was between Kent and Wythe and South 4th and South 3rd Street in Williamsburg. And after 2 years of operation on that initial site, they invited us to move across the street in between the East River and Kent Avenue in 2015. And so we built the farm again at that second site, redesigned. And several years later, as they started constructing Domino Park, our borders shifted back. So we lost half of our space that was closer to the East River and gained an equal amount of space along Kent Avenue. And so redesigned and rebuilt the farm again at that time, which was a lot of work. And it was an interesting agreement because we were essentially given access to the land in exchange for operating a public park, green space, and farm, essentially to greenwash the development and act as almost a unpaid community liaison for this developer. And that was the situation that we found ourselves in. And while we were able to do a lot of really good work there, then 7 years when they were ready to develop, the project ended. Yeah.
Yep, that tenuous piece. Yeah, Ximena or Saada, would you like to join in as well? Sorry, I opened it up to everybody. I went off my own cue. Sawdayah, do you want to mention, because I think what we're hearing from Kenny is like private land and how private developers will engage us, and it's coming up in the chat too, will engage activism and artists and growers around activating on land, but in this very temporary time. And I think it also kind of all opens that door to the spectrum of like community land, trust land, and how does that show up in land stewardship and tenure?
Yeah, that was such a difficult story to hear. I'm so sorry that happened, Kenny, because it's such a common thing. And I think that, I don't want to speak for the elders who were present during the late 90s and really kind of brokered that deal in 2002. But I think those who elected to go the route of the community land trust model elected that route because they were tired of dealing with the city and dealing with agencies and being talked to and then being lied to in that same way that Kenny described. And, I think what's difficult about being a community land trust is it's really up to you to raise all of the capital you need to maintain that. And so while private institutions will absolutely engage you in such a way where you are the landowner, And so they have a specific, they have to talk to you to get certain access to, let's say my property is bordering your property and you want to build on it, or you have to cut down a tree, or you need access to install wiring for internet or whatever. You know, they will engage with us, but for those that know better, that we're a community land trust with not a very big budget, they can also try to intimidate you. And so, you know, speaking practically, the things that community land trusts absolutely have to be mindful of are building relationships, you know, beyond those of us within our family unit, and bringing in folks into the family unit who can support, either in a low cost or pro bono way, legal advice, who can support us in fundraising, because there are a number of things that can still threaten your ability to steward the land, even though you have the deed to it. Intimidation from private companies, larger companies, you know, making sure that you have the capital to keep up with the insurance costs, or rampant violations that you may receive from the DOH, which seem very just random. But you know, there are a number of just, it's like the grass is green, and also you're in another echelon of stewardship, of maintenance that requires another level of financial income, which we don't really gain those things because we're a nonprofit.
I just want to jump in and just say it's sort of infuriating to hear both those stories where you have control over the land by a private entity, which is certainly the model of capitalism in the United States, but it is sort of, it's a greenwashing, like Kenny said. And then you hear also the story of a model that the government has put in place, but has inherently put up barriers to that model. We're like, here, you can have this, but in the process, we're going to put up all these barriers that you have to overcome to actually achieve the goals that they proclaim it wanting to achieve. You know, and I walked by a planter on the street the other day, just briefly, a very small planter, like 4 by 2 feet, with some bushes in it. There were on the side of the planter, it was there because of a council member, 2 nonprofits, and 3 city agencies. That's how hard it was to get a planter on the sidewalk. You know, so I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I got a little.
No, thank you for saying that. It's so difficult. It's so difficult. And it's also, I think, really, really important. Everything that all of the panelists have been saying, especially, you know, what you said, Ximena, about the relationship building aspect, because it is such labor intensive work and you are usually not paid for this work. It's a labor of love, absolutely. And so there has to be, you know, we have to internally be very clear about what our goals are and how we're moving forward together, and move forward from a place of solidarity, because there are all of these other entities, you know, that are either threatening directly or indirectly the continuation of that work.
Absolutely. I also, when you mentioned the land trusts and the incapacity of fully embracing the work of being there because you're so busy trying to fundraise and trying to get the money to actually care for the space. We're seeing the similar issues in the art nonprofit sector. Like the way I can circulate resources is through a nonprofit, and we have very similar stories. Like you're then up just writing these grants over and over and justifying your existence, and while you're justifying your existence, then the actual programs are not being care the way you wish you could care for them. And I think one of our issues has been also when mentioning, just because somebody put in the art washing or greenwashing that Kenny spoke about, I think one of the issues that happened with the arts is that because there are not actually like community land trust models that exist for community gardens. I wish there will be also a model that engage like art community centers, where the artists themselves are the stewardships of the community centers, and not the institutions that always work in the trickle down fundraising pyramid. And when the artists actually are centering the community and how they want to have the relationship with the community, which at the end is not the artists, right? It's the farmers, it's the people, it's us together figure out how we create culture. So another thing was the relationship to the public line of streets and plazas. We have done, like, our more recent work was, for example, at Astor Place Plaza. We used to have a block party for 10 years in our street. And one day we couldn't have it anymore because the city wanted $25,000 suddenly out of the flu, because we had performers. And suddenly that made it like it was something else, that it was not a street event of like a barbecue. So it's dealing with that. Right now we are about to have open culture, which is also going to be like being able to have artists in the street. But it's all these limitations of like, well, you have to move your cones every day. We have to find a way we reclaim the public line, both like the land trust, the vacant land, but also the streets, but how we do it in a way that we collaborate, knowing that all communities are in a different place, coming from a different place.
Great. Thank you. This conversation and this part in particular is so rich. And I just want to thank everybody in terms of the panel session, because I think this is actually a really good point for us to transition into the breakout session, where we'll be able to speak in smaller groups a little bit more. And again, the panelists will be joining us. So Saada, if you have more to share, and Ximena and Sawdayah and Kenny, if there's more that you want to lift up on the topic of land and land stewardship, I encourage to unpack that with folks in the breakout room. And I think as well as the topic of something that we should also switch in the breakout room is getting folks talking or thinking about, like, when we talk about shifting to resiliency, and we're hearing the issues around stewardship and food models and building long-term measures and viability and community decision-making, like, what can the government, what in the city in particular, right? There's a few different races. Benjamin's in one, there's a mayoral race going on. Like, let's also use that as a time to talk about if there's these persistent issues around food insecurity and the lack of support around the work that we want to see, and the potential of co-optation of this grassroots work. What do we want our city council or other electeds to do? And what's your solutions to moving towards resiliency? So we're gonna take a quick transition to let Anya move us into breakouts. And I will just quickly explain what the breakouts are going to be. Alexis and I are gonna co-facilitate. We'll have some prompts. We want folks to have a chance to share and lift up. We'll be taking notes, and then we'll be passing those, doing a high-level summary in the report back, which will be quick, but there will be longer notes that Ben will share on his website, and we'll share a little bit more at the end. So we will see each other in breakouts and then see each other in full group right after.
And I'm really just trying to learn more about how that could be a tool for projects like ours. And I'm just interested in hearing any other ideas that people have. It seems like a lot of people are working towards creating food security and community resiliency. And it seems like some of the ways that space is controlled in the city are the rules around that are kind of like designed against the community. And I just wonder, I don't know how to fix that. That's what, I want to learn more about how that, what tools are out there for the community.
Yeah, I think community land trusts and worker-owned models are definitely something that's kind of evolving and it's growing in New York City. So think about, what does that look like for like land access and using space for community use. I think it can show up in a lot of different ways, but definitely I think CLTs is something that, at least in like my community, East New York, there's some growing movements around that and thinking about how the community is in charge of deciding how we want to use this land together and how can we ensure fair access to space that often is, gone to the highest dollar.
Right.
Definitely some learnings on that, CLTs and worker co-ops models.
Emma, do you want to go to the other breakout room just to get a broader view? Since I noticed all three of you were here. Let me,
I would love that.
I think I just did that. She just happened, for the other one, she partnered with Kenny and Henry on the project, so
Right.
she was hearing their own people talk. Sorry, I didn't interrupt.
That's okay. We were reflecting on that last question that Qiana left us with. What are some recommendations or desires for how the city can respond to a more resilient cultural food production, community space use in our communities?
I just wanted to bring up one thing that Sawdayah dropped in the chat that I thought was really smart. She said the red tape seems to grow with each step closer to sovereignty, which I thought was just really well put. And we didn't get to it in the larger group, but although like we at North Brooklyn Farms, there are some barriers to using private land. There were also a lot of positive aspects of it. We didn't really deal with any red tape. There were very few regulations. We were kind of able to provide whatever sort of services the community really wanted. We had really quick feedback and then action. We were like very agile we were a for-profit company there. We didn't really make money, but we paid for the project ourselves from revenues. So there were a lot of like positive aspects of it. And I would like to see incentives for more private land to be utilized, especially while it sits vacant for sometimes decades.
Yeah.
But I think a problem that we ran into, maybe not as much us, but I can see a scenario in which, private land is available to be used by the community, a green space or some other like cool project, art project, food project, raises the value of that land so much that then like it spells the demise of the project. But I still see like a lot of potential in utilizing private vacant land. I'm not sure what the exact answer is, but.
Okay, so I'll jump in here. But so as you were all speaking, so this was I think we were going to touch on it in the main group, but we didn't get to it about like, so 2 days, let's just say this week, the Mayor's Office for Food Policy released something called the 10-year food plan. And usually the idea, so this one is actually codified into law. So usually how emergency food contracts and all of these things work is whoever's like the lowest bidder, the city will pick that person to like fulfill whatever that contract is. But they're hoping that with this like 10-year food policy plan that they will actually be codified into law so that if they don't follow it, potential vendors can like sue them or whatever it is that the next steps are. But the reason why I'm bringing this up is, so fortunately we were invited to some of the stakeholder discussions that like actually ended up bringing out about this document. And one of the things that the mayor's office was mentioning is the fact that I believe either by 2030 or some year like that, they want to have like a certain percentage of food that the city is purchasing actually be produced either in New York City, New York State, or ideally the tri-state area. So I do think, I haven't gone through the plan in its entirety, so I can't really speak to it, but there is something in it about there is one thing about, I believe, incubators for like trying to have good food jobs, that they're supposed to come up with a good food purchasing program guidelines as well. So there is something in that that aspect, Kenny and Harry, if you wanted to like look at it, because I do think the idea is that they want to have some. You could probably make that argument, and we brought this up actually during the stakeholder discussions as well. Like, there's so many abandoned lots, and if the city is so concerned about the fact that a lot of the food is not being produced in the state, that, for instance, like they could switch to actually utilizing some of those abandoned lots where we could actually try to come out with a few more like urban farmers, then they would just purchase it directly from there. That then leads to a lot of other benefits, because then it reduces food waste. Like, you don't have food that will have to travel tens of thousands of miles or kilometers to get to New York City. There is that aspect. There's also the emissions from the transportation. You can reduce that as well. And we made the argument as well, if you do it in New York City or in New York State, at the very least, like the composting, for instance, if there is like the excess food aspect, you could then use the excess as like a feed to like for the farms in upstate, to use it as a feed for whatever it is they're growing as well. Anyways, short version is you should look at that document. I think there might be something about it in relation to this.
Yeah, kind of timely, right? The food plan came out maybe yesterday or the day before. And I was also part of some of the meetings, but I think it kind of gives the gamut of food production, food access, emergency food, really looking at ways that the city can respond now and respond better to the emergency, but then also some long-term solutions. And that also brings up for me, I don't know if it was mentioned during this panel, but yeah, what is the next step? We have like these priorities and we want these codified, and we want to make sure that it is, again, community led, and these aren't just top-down responses from the city. I think that brings us into the question around like community engagement and how community is informing these things. They had the meetings, but now what? As they're planning to develop or propose additional stuff, how do we see the community being involved there? Or how would you like to see the community being involved there?
Masa, do you have, I'm not sure if that's your name, is that right, Masa? It says that on the.
I think,
I just wanted
especially I'm observing, and so I'm a little bit poor information. So I'm learning. So right now, yeah, that kind of things.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, this is a great opportunity, right? Being in front of the person who's running in your district. Would you have any suggestions for Ben around how he could engage the community around issues of food access, land access, community space?
I'm wondering how much food throw the garbage, and how much food was a rescue, which is like some system connecting this kind of way, and then someone need food, and then that food go to this kind of people, which is include me. So something I'm wondering. So
Yeah, I think let's talk about that. I think I was with somebody the other day. We doing some composting in North Brooklyn, and we were talking about the fact that there is plenty of food out there. We have more than enough food to feed people, and the amount of food that goes into waste is just unacceptable. And there are certain groups like City Harvest and some others that do take food and repurpose it or find other people who need it. And then, of course, composting is not happening officially in the city, but it should. And that's, if you're going to have food waste, that's one way to do it. And you're always going to have some waste, whether eggshells or coffee grounds. So, the city, unfortunately, in this crisis, has canceled composting on a residential level. You can still bring it to some sites, but there's been numerous groups that have started composting on their own and sort of working with some of the bigger nonprofit processors to collect, their community groups that collect it from the community and then bring it to the processors. And the need, we actually had composting on the list of one of these topics at one point for this event. And I said, that's just everybody's gonna want to talk about composting. It'll be what the conversation's about. And there's not a lot of controversy about it, but I think on a home level, you need to be more aware of what you're buying and eating and throwing away. And we need to do that on a systemic level too. And I remember a UN, I'm not sure if this is part of the question, but a UN report from several years ago that showed that middle and small farms can feed the people that we need to feed. And we rely on these big agricultural, monocultural farms in the Midwest, and that just destroys the environment and is bad on so many levels. But when you actually grow your own food or know where it's grown, you're much more careful with it, I think, and you're much more aware of it. So I hope that does that answer. That's why I think bringing it back locally is so important.
Thank you.
Yeah, I remember that report that came out that said that, on a smaller scale, we can feed our communities. And that left me wondering, like, why aren't we doing that? Or why isn't that being prioritized? And that brings me back to the 10-year food plan as an opportunity for community to be more involved in what becomes prioritized here. And if food production at, community vacant lots and community gardens becomes like a major priority, how are gardens being supported in that? Understanding that it is strictly volunteer, as Sawdayah let us know, and as we probably all know. So what then becomes the relationship between the city and these growing spaces and food production, local food production?
Well, I wanted to just add that I think some of these places that are growing food in the city could also be great distribution hubs for food that's grown elsewhere. Just from like a square footage standpoint, maybe there's not a ton of space to grow a ton of food, but just by bringing the community together, you create an opportunity to distribute food. And Saada, I don't know how distribution takes place and with the organization that you work for. So that's like one kind of thing I'm curious about, if like the type of work that like Kenny and I are doing could actually help with the distribution of like people who really do need to eat food. It doesn't necessarily need to be, they don't necessarily need to go into a garden and have that experience in a garden, but could those two things work together? And then also, Alexis, I wanted to kind of respond to one of your questions about like community engagement. And I think a lot of the community input that I've seen, especially around like real estate development, which is the world that we were kind of working in, it's really whoever has the time, money, or resources to show up to these meetings to provide input. And it's even something that in like urban planning classes, they teach, this to the students, like, yeah, like the community wasn't represented, like the community isn't represented, people who are really struggling might not have the energy or resources or access to providing that input. And I just wonder, like, if that's something that we would hope in our new space to be able to help, enhance people's voices. But just wonder if there's anything happening in that realm. Ben, you might know about this, about just like trying to reach out and really actually find out what the community wants, rather than whoever can send a representative to a input meeting to read a letter.
Saada, you want to?
Yeah, I can attempt. So this was my big thing during the whole like 10-year food policy plan stakeholder engagement sessions, in that. So, and I made this argument to them as well. It's like, okay, it is one thing to come out with a fancy policy document as always, but my main question was always, how do you actually ensure that it is actually implemented? Like, because the follow through is always the main issue. You come up with a document, but the implementation process is it usually end up like lacking. So according to the mayor's office, what they're hoping to do, especially for this plan specifically, they're hoping to go back to the same discussions when it comes to the implementation phase. And quite honestly, while the stakeholder discussions that involve the larger community, the community-based organizations and the nonprofits and whoever were involved in the discussion, it was actually well represented. That much I can give you. So you get anywhere from like the big places like Public Health Solutions to smaller places like anyways from like maybe Sawdayah's Brooklyn Queens Land Trust to even like small places like Rethink. So there was somewhat represented during that discussion. So I'm hoping, I honestly can't see any other way to translate it where there's like a broader community engagement. I think probably the only way that could end up doing is they had like sort of like focus group discussions, but that might end up just being time consuming and also the money involved. So I don't think they will go to that far. But according to them, what they're hoping to do is do the same thing, have like as broad as like nonprofits and think tanks and whoever's involved during the implementation phase so that they can actually have like very diverse voices of like the different communities that are involved. But I also wanted to touch on I think it was Masa that talked a little bit about, yes, food recovery. So we used to do that. So Rethink specifically before the pandemic, all we did for the most part was actually, so our partnership, we had partnership with restaurants, hotels, and some grocery stores where we'll pick up their excess food and then convert them into new meals, which were then distributed to different like soup kitchens, pantries, who then distributed to like the individuals who need it. But one of the things that happened, obviously, during the pandemic, there aren't a lot of excess food in restaurants, hotels, and whatever. We still get a little bit from like maybe Trader Joe's or one or two urban farms as well. But the issue with this particular one is the fact that, so there is the Good Samaritan law, which says that something along the lines that if you give somebody something in like good faith, and if something happens to them, you're not going to be penalized for it. So if you donate food and it ends up being contaminated, as long as you did it like with good faith, nothing is going to happen to you. That law could be strengthened where it will specifically be tailored to food, where it's not just tailored to restaurants where you're trying to prevent like restaurant level food waste, but try to do it in a way where you start at like the farm level. Because the issue is the fact that sometimes we think of the food system as starting like in the middle instead of starting at the farm level. Because if you can reduce it at the farm level and then you can reduce it at all the other stages, by the time it gets to the household level, it's not as much. But we end up just focusing more on the household level with like the food, trying to prevent food waste as well. I don't know if I'm making sense, but what I'm trying to say is like the Good Samaritan law would have to be strengthened for people to actually be willing to donate. It's because a lot of restaurants are claiming that, or they weren't even sure that they could donate their excess food or whatever the issue was, or they were afraid that if they donated and maybe something ended up happening to whoever got the food, that then they will end up like being sued for it. So there's difficulties around it, but that could be one of the ways the city could do it. Actually, it could actually end up being a good way where the city is subsidizing either farms or whoever it is. So instead of throwing away their produce, they could distribute it to the emergency food providers who actually need it, because then you end up getting fresh food. You end up partnering them with emergency food providers to provide them with the fresh food. But you're also giving the farmers, the urban farmers, the revenue they actually need to, I don't know, keep going.
It's interesting.
Yeah, a similar, it's a statewide program similar to what you're speaking about is, it's called the Nourish New York program, where we saw at the beginning of the pandemic where a lot of farms were dumping their products or turning over their fields because they had lost their clients. And so the state like funneled money specifically to New York State farmers to be able to connect them with the larger pantry systems and then trickle that into the community. Just going back to Henry's comment about like around like community engagement, right? Like it is like whoever has the time, has the technology, has the energy to show up will show up. And oftentimes we miss most marginalized communities. And I think something that I think maybe Sawdayah was talking about, or Ximena, around how do we like do our engagement differently, thinking about like if we already come together for meals, how do we come together for meals, and also think about how we can inform this policy proposal that's happening on a very small scale. I feel like community engagement often happens like, you know, we do the first stage community engagement and then the city will decide to do everything else without community. But what is a different system that involves community along the way, that is led by community. I'll go back to like the community land trust organizing in East New York, where like it's not a community-led project. It is something that a bunch of neighbors came together and have gotten resources to spend time to like think about and plot and plan and figure that out before like going forward with development. And that's, you know, obviously a small scale example, but how, yeah, what does this look different? How can we shift the way that the city works and have them not kind of like rely on, you know, this is the way we normally do our urban planning, this is how we do our engagement. Step one, talk to community, and then figure the rest out. And there's like so many things happening on the city right now, just around the elections, but also like legislation being put forth around comprehensive planning in the city. And I can imagine a lot of my neighbors had no idea that there was a hearing on this legislation yesterday. So, you know, I don't have the answers, but we know that.
I'll mention, I mean, community outreach is difficult. I mean, I've been involved, there's two things I'll quickly mention. I've been involved in participatory budgeting since it came here. And it's hard to really get to the people that you want to talk to. It's very easy to talk to people with all due, you know, like you guys who are active and interested in the conversation. But when you want to reach people who have two jobs and kids and aren't looped into this stuff, you have to really go there to get to them, and it's hard. And it's sometimes more valuable to do that than to have a community board meeting, to be honest. But also, you know, in our district, we've been going through the Gowanus rezoning for the last, it seems like 25 years, but the last like 2 years. And the city had a plan, and they brought it to the community, and they had over 100 meetings altogether. And the plan's not that much different than they came in with. They tweaked it. There's some different, you know, there's some things here or there, and they're probably better. And maybe it wasn't a really bad plan to begin with, but it's not that much different, right? So it's you know, I respect the people that have worked on it, but that's sort of what happens. You know, people come and they're like, we checked that box. We had those meetings. We heard the community. Great. Now I can move on. And that's hopefully what we can avoid. We have about 5 more minutes, I think, or so, 6, but just we'll get a little picture in a minute to tell us what's up. But any other, yeah, sorry, I don't mean to take over, Alexis. Go ahead.
No, not at all. That's great.
I just have one anecdote about community input that we experienced at North Brooklyn Farms, which was being a part of seeing the community input process for the next parcel that Two Trees was developing.
Oh yeah.
And it was it's frustrating because by the time, in this case, a developer presents a plan, it's so far beyond what the community, for this particular development, it was already so far beyond what this community, what that neighborhood ever would dream of wanting. By the time it was like, hey, do you guys want this?
Yeah.
At that point, like, the tweaks aren't what people are interested in. Yeah. It's the decision making about, is this piece of vacant waterfront property going to be 2 giant towers or a public space? But that's way too far in the past. It, like, by the time it reaches the community input session, it's basically already done.
Yeah.
I had one other thing to say, but I can't remember now.
Well, just say what happened. We lost somebody? No. Oh, Anya went away. For that particular plan, it's two 600 feet buildings with a very interesting park, and they had designed the park and they designed the buildings, and they basically said, "What do you want in the park?" You know, and that's not what it's all about. I think we're going to get that 1 minute clock in a second, but
oh, and I just had one more thing about I think, like, community input. I mean, there's so many aspects of it to make it more effective, but I do think it all comes down to, like, space, having spaces in communities where people feel part of the community and feel like they have the opportunity to have input, and also like places where people gather and kind of like discuss community issues. So I think like going back to like what Sawdayah was saying, or wait, who was saying it? Something that was discussed earlier, just about I guess going back to nonprofits, going back to organizations that are intimately tied to the community and gathering input that way, like going directly to the spaces where people already gather. That being said, to gather like better input and know what people really want and need, there needs to be more space for that engagement to happen, I guess.
Yeah, I agree. So before we get kicked out, I'm not sure how much time we have left, but I would love to just like go around. There's one of the questions, suggested questions was, do you feel that urban farms, community gardens, and other parcels of land are hubs for culture and food? I don't want to assume everybody's answer, but I think we're in a shared community here. If so, what do you envision is needed to support resilient food and culture pathways?
What's it? So what do you think is needed to support that?
Right.
Anybody, jump in.
I mean,
I think it's space. Just access to space would be a really great start. And there's a lot of space that's unused. And there are all these different agencies that control it, that, you know, the EDC or the, NYCHA, there is space out there. And, and then I guess we would need, people to work on creating those hubs in that space. It seems pretty, seems like a start.
Oh, I just want to add, just like, this is just from the city website, but there's over 13,000 acres of vacant city-owned property, available. And like, we should use it.
13,000 acres?
Over 13,000 acres.
That's a lot of space.
That's a lot of space.
The point is, space is there. We need to.
Space is there, yeah.
Yeah.
They said they closed the rooms, but I haven't seen.
We have 30 more seconds.
Oh, you see that?
Yeah, I got to pop up here.
No, it didn't pop up on our screen.
Maybe because you're
Oh, I'm a host.
Yeah. Masa, do you have a response or something?
Response. No. No. I mean,
That's okay.
Yeah.
Masa, did you say you lived in? Oh. Is that everybody back? I know we've lost some people, but that's it's been a long time. We're a little over time, so I know. We'll
okay.
Mark Gelb is still frozen. I noticed he texted me that his computer was frozen, and he looks like he still is. Qiana, do you want to say anything before we?
Yes, I mean, I hope. So I know we're a little short on time, so I want to be respectful of people's time. I would say, just to make sure folks know, if you do have to step out or leave, that part of what we're doing here is the notes that we took in the groups and in the chat. We're going to synthesize or like codify in order to then share it with Benjamin, who will share externally for folks on the website. So we want to make sure folks are able to see it, and it's also going to inform his food platform on his website as well. Yes. So we just wanted to make sure folks felt not just seen in the present time, but these notes are going to be utilized to share and available. It will be synthesized though. We wanted, so if in case you were wondering if you had to transition out, but we wanted to offer a report back. I'm going to encourage me and Alexis to just maybe do a really kind of quick one, because again, we'll be sharing broader notes later. And then we can offer thanks and let folks go. How does that sound?
Yeah, like a 1 minute wrap up.
Yes. So yeah, and Alexis, do you want to start, or I'm happy to start?
Sure, I can go ahead and start. Yeah, we had a great conversation. We started with the question around what does resiliency look like and what do we need? And I think a lot of folks were really struck by the community land trust model that Sawdayah shared, and wanting to understand like what are the possibilities for doing that as far as increasing land access and increasing the availability of community spaces. We really spent time talking through like what community engagement processes have looked like in the past or as recently, kind of focusing on the 10-year food policy planning process, and one, understanding like who was involved in that, and then also how our community going to be brought in now that we know where their priorities, how is community being looped into those next steps. And then thinking about like what's needed for a future that is food resilient or resilient in general. Kenny shared a stat, there's 13,000 acres of available space. And we want to know what's going on with that space.
Public land, yeah.
Public land, yeah, publicly owned land. And we want to know how we use that. How does the community get access to that?
Oh, awesome. Thank you. That was an awesome report back. I'm going to try to do my group justice. It was such a rich conversation. I think you'll also find some of what we were chatting about in the chat as well. But I think, and again, feel free to like correct me or edit me in the chat. But what was really coming up, a big theme around connecting in genuine ways to resource, community building, and change in terms of growing, in terms of land, connecting to resources, understanding what structures or entities either support that work, how to like amplify community leadership, but also what have been some of the barriers and what are the things we want to hear and see that we feel will build transformative policy, food and farm policy. So we talked about ways that we can support each other now, the work that's happening on the ground now, but also how we see how capitalism, impacts our models and our work and creates these barriers, and wanting policy to have less red tape and bureaucracy so we can really move to see the change that we want to see. And fighting against the for-profit mentality or only seeing profit. So I'm really glad at the end we started lifting up not just the importance of data and impact, but where is our metrics and standards that really speak to the work that we're doing in equity, and wanting to continue to fight against just for-profit mentality or just data that only speaks to a framework that will never or potentially not meet because it's not really amplifying what is really needed, and like how to value community work and engagement. There's just certain ways that you're not going to quantify in that way. So how do we connect and still support each other in the immediate and in the long term? And grassroots support, unincorporated business, so grassroots community garden support, but also small business support. Like we really want to see a connection in production and logistics and supply on the hyperlocal level, and connections to the upstate, because that's where our regional partners are, but not at the detriment or just marginalizing our communities as just spaces to live, that there's actual production here as well that could also be supporting our neighborhoods in our region moving forward. So thank you again for everybody sharing. And even if you didn't say anything or you didn't chat, having your energy here just means a lot. I wanna thank the panelists for joining, Alexis for jumping in and facilitating, Anya for jumping in on the tech. We've had no snafus. And Ben, thank you so much for hosting this really important conversation that I think people felt resonated. And we also talked about food in such unique ways and culture and how we want to see our electeds, hopefully, as these races continue to be informed moving forward.
Yeah, I thank you so much for everybody to be here. Politicians love to talk a long time, so I will, but I will not do that because it's a little late. You've all given so much thoughts and time here. I appreciate it. We will get back to you with notes on this. bensolitaire2021.com is the website for more information about me. But thank you again so much to all the panelists and to Anya and to the various friends I see hanging on. And we will continue this conversation. So enjoy the rest of your night. And again, it was really inspiring. So good night, everybody.
Thank you.
Hi, thank
Good night,
you.
everybody.
Thank you.
Awesome.